March 1945, Lake Balaton, Hungary. Picture this. Hitler's most elite soldiers, his personal bodyguard unit called the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, sitting defeated in the Hungarian mud. 2 weeks ago, they rolled into battle with 50 to 60 powerful tanks. Now, only a dozen still work. An officer scribbles in his report, his hand shaking. The men are completely exhausted. Some just walked away from their positions. We've lost contact with entire companies. Everyone knows the end is coming. This is how legends die. Not in some glorious final battle, but because we ran out of fuel, our machines broke down, and the cold mathematics of war caught up with us. Now let's go back 2 years to understand how the mighty fell so far. July 1943, the Kursk salient in Russia. That same elite division, the Leibstandarte, charges forward as the tip of the spear for Germany's 2nd SS Panzer Corps. They've got 15,000 men, 90 of the best tanks Germany can build, and a reputation for being unstoppable. Their mission sounds simple: smash through Soviet defenses and turn the tide of the war back in Germany's favor. Everyone believes they're invincible, but they're about to crash headfirst into the largest tank battle in human history. And reality doesn't care about reputations. These soldiers didn't start as warriors. They began as Hitler's personal bodyguards, parading around in sharp black uniforms at those massive Nazi rallies in Nuremberg. They were the poster boys of the regime, hand-picked to look impressive. But by 1943, they'd transformed into battle-hardened veterans who'd fought their way across Poland, France, Greece, and deep into Russia. Nazi propaganda painted them as superhuman warriors who couldn't be beaten. And honestly, their early victories seemed to prove it. They'd broken through enemy lines, surrounded entire armies, and conquered nation after nation. But now their commander, Sepp Dietrich, was being asked to pull off a miracle that would reverse 2 solid years of German retreat. Operation Citadel at Kursk was Hitler's last desperate gamble to grab back the initiative in the east. The Leibstandarte rolled into battle with those 15,000 men and 90 working tanks, a mix of brand-new Panther tanks with devastating guns and thick armor, the terrifying Tiger tanks that made Soviet tankers break out in cold sweats, and the reliable old Panzer YFs that had been the backbone of German armored forces. These were the most advanced war machines Germany could produce. The Panthers could destroy Soviet tanks from distances the enemy couldn't even dream of matching. The Tigers were so feared that Soviet tank crews had learned it was better to avoid them entirely if possible. But here's the problem that was already showing itself. Those shiny new Panthers had constant mechanical problems. Many broke down in the muddy terrain before they even reached the Soviet lines. Transmissions failed, engines caught fire, suspensions collapsed in the soft ground. The Tigers, while absolutely devastating when they worked, drank fuel like water and needed mechanics constantly fussing over them. This elite equipment, designed for fast-moving warfare where tanks could maneuver freely, was about to be thrown into a grinding meat grinder against an enemy who'd spent months digging in and preparing layer after layer of defenses. Sepp Dietrich watched his division roll forward with complete confidence. He believed in their training, their equipment, their willingness to die for their cause. He expected they'd break through, surround the Soviet forces, and restore Germany's strategic advantage that had been lost at Stalingrad 6 months earlier. Within 12 days, that confidence would be completely shattered against Soviet steel and cold, hard mathematics. The kind of math that doesn't give a damn about elite status or propaganda myths. The Panthers pushed forward through the Kursk salient, their powerful guns searching for targets. But the Soviets had been preparing for months. Every possible approach was filled with mines. Every hilltop bristled with anti-tank guns. Every counterattack was perfectly coordinated. The Leibstandarte's crews were incredibly skilled, and their equipment was advanced, but they were attacking straight into a meat grinder that cared nothing about reputation. The Soviet defensive system was built in multiple layers going back for miles. The first German assault waves hit massive minefields that forced them into narrow channels, right into killing zones. When the Panthers crested hills expecting to chase fleeing infantry, instead they found dug-in anti-tank guns and T-34 tanks waiting in ambush. Soviet commanders had been studying German tactics for 2 years. They knew exactly how the Panthers would advance, where the Tigers would position themselves to provide covering fire, and they'd prepared accordingly. All that tactical skill that had won victories in France and Greece meant absolutely nothing here. This wasn't about clever maneuvers anymore. This was pure attrition, a battle of who could lose more men and machines and still keep fighting. During the battle, the Leibstandarte lost tanks to mines, artillery barrages, and wave after wave of coordinated Soviet counterattacks. Those supposedly invincible Panthers, with their powerful guns and sloped armor, proved just as vulnerable to mechanical breakdowns as they were to enemy fire. Crews watched helplessly as vehicles that had survived direct Soviet hits died from transmission failures in the thick mud. One crew reported their Panther caught fire from the engine overheating before they'd even fired a shot at the enemy. Another crew watched their tank sink up to its axles in soft ground, completely immobilized, sitting there like a perfect target. The mathematics favored whoever had more reserves to throw into the fight. The Soviets could afford losses because they had factories beyond the Ural Mountains churning out thousands of tanks. They had millions of men they could call up. The Germans had what they brought to Kursk, and behind them was nothing but increasingly desperate emergency measures. Sepp Dietrich's confident offensive leadership crashed into reality. He'd led his division into the salient expecting a breakthrough. Instead, he watched his best units bleed themselves white against defenses that seemed to regenerate faster than his forces could penetrate them. Every single kilometer gained cost armor and men the division couldn't replace. Soviet counterattacks hammered exhausted German units before they could consolidate whatever ground they'd taken. Fresh Soviet tank brigades appeared in places where German intelligence swore there were no enemy forces. By July 17, 1943, when Hitler finally called off Operation Citadel, the mathematics were impossible to deny. The Leibstandarte had suffered approximately 1,200 killed, wounded, or missing. Tank losses ranged from 50% to 70% of their original strength. With only a handful of Panthers still operational by the battle's end, the entire 2nd SS Panzer Corps reported 2,700 casualties and 72 tanks lost permanently. These weren't just numbers on a page. These were the division's most experienced tank commanders, veteran infantry leaders who'd survived years of combat, irreplaceable specialists who couldn't be replaced. The myth starts cracking here in the mud and fire of Kursk. No amount of tactical excellence can make up for strategic overreach. Elite training cannot overcome being in an impossible operational situation. The Leibstandarte would be rebuilt, re-equipped, and sent back into action. But the strategic initiative was gone forever. From this moment forward, every German operation would be defensive, reactive, just a fighting retreat back toward Germany's borders. And the worst was still coming. In the muddy fields of Hungary, Hitler would gamble his elite guard one final desperate time. Here's the brutal truth about elite divisions. They're only as effective as their supply lines. By 1945, the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler still had well-trained soldiers and advanced equipment. Panthers, the massive Tiger II tanks, assault guns. But these advantages meant absolutely nothing when those tanks sat immobile, because there was no fuel. When crews had to ration ammunition to just 20 rounds per day. When Soviet aircraft destroyed supply convoys before they could even reach the front lines. Elite status, it turned out, couldn't run on propaganda alone. That same equipment paradox that had plagued the division at Kursk had now metastasized into complete systemic collapse. During operations in Hungary, the Leibstandarte often received only 1/3 of its daily fuel requirements. Commanders had to make impossible choices about which tanks could move and which would have to sit stationary like pillboxes. A Panther tank without fuel is just a 45-ton roadblock. A Tiger II without fuel is a bunker that can't retreat when the enemy flanks around it. Ammunition shortages were equally crippling. Frontline units were limited to 20 or 30 rounds per tank gun per day, far below what was needed for effective combat. In training, crews had practiced with hundreds of rounds to master their weapons. In combat, they were told to make every single shot count because there might not be a resupply convoy tomorrow. You couldn't maneuver. You couldn't sustain fire. You could only wait and hope the Soviets attacked exactly where you happened to be positioned. The Tiger II perfectly embodied this cruel mathematics. Only 492 were ever produced, each one costing as much as several Soviet T-34 tanks. These massive vehicles mounted the fearsome 88mm gun and boasted armor 150mm thick on the front, theoretically invincible. The gun could punch through any Soviet tank at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers, and the frontal armor could shrug off most Soviet anti-tank weapons. But they guzzled fuel and suffered constant mechanical breakdowns. During Spring Awakening, many German armored vehicles were simply abandoned due to mechanical failure or lack of fuel. Elite armor reduced to roadside monuments. Crews set demolition charges and walked away from vehicles that represented months of production capacity, just leaving them there. Soviet operational superiority had grown overwhelming. Red Air Force attacks on rail lines and supply convoys, combined with partisan fighters disrupting rear areas, meant German units were increasingly operating at half strength or less. Soviet Sturmovik ground attack aircraft hunted supply trucks on the roads. Partisans blew up railway bridges behind German lines. Fuel depots that took weeks to establish were destroyed in minutes by airstrikes. No amount of tactical skill could compensate for empty fuel tanks and burning supply depots. Even the myth of elite volunteers was crumbling. By 1945, the Leibstandarte was increasingly drafting boys aged 16 and 17 to replace mounting losses. Soviet reports confirmed capturing very young soldiers among SS prisoners in Hungary and Austria. Teenagers in uniforms too large for them, carrying weapons they'd barely learned to fire. One Soviet interrogator recorded, "The prisoner claimed to be 18, but looked no older than 15. He'd been in uniform for 6 weeks. This is what their so-called master race has been reduced to." The elite guard was now drafting children to fill ranks that once required years of training and ideological vetting. Into this logistical nightmare, Hitler ordered his guard one final time to attack in Hungary, to recapture the Lake Balaton oil fields, to achieve the impossible. The objective was crystal clear. Without those oil fields, Germany's remaining war machine would grind to a complete halt within months. The fuel crisis that had crippled operations since Kursk would become total paralysis. Operation Spring Awakening would be the Leibstandarte's last offensive and its complete destruction. March 6, 1945. The Leibstandarte attacks toward Lake Balaton, spearheading Hitler's final offensive attempt. But Soviet Marshal Tolbukin was waiting for them. Soviet reconnaissance had tracked every single German movement, every concentration of armor. The Third Ukrainian Front was ready, dug in deep and heavily reinforced. What followed wasn't really a battle. It was a slaughter measured in abandoned tanks and shattered units. Operation Spring Awakening was supposed to recapture Hungary's oil fields, the fuel that might keep Germany's war machine running for a few more desperate months. The Leibstandarte rolled forward with 10 to 12,000 men and 50 to 60 tanks, part of the 6th SS Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich. The same commander who'd led them at Kursk now commanded the entire SS armored force in Hungary. He reportedly lamented, "Hitler expects miracles from us, but what can we possibly do with empty tanks and no reinforcements?" The objective was clear, the need was desperate, but the offensive was doomed before the first shot was fired. Soviet intelligence had achieved total superiority. Aerial reconnaissance photographed German tank concentrations. Radio intercepts decoded movement orders before German units even received them. Partisan reports pinpointed assembly areas near Lake Balaton. Marshal Tolbukin reinforced threatened sectors, prepared defensive positions, and positioned his 4th Guards Army exactly where the German spearheads would strike. The Germans achieved zero strategic surprise. They were attacking straight into a prepared killing ground. Every single advantage the Leibstandarte had possessed at Kursk was now completely reversed. The Soviets knew they were coming. The Soviets chose the battlefield. The Soviets had fuel and ammunition in abundance. The offensive stalled within days. Those same fuel shortages that had crippled German logistics since Kursk now strangled this attack at birth. Tanks that broke through initial Soviet positions couldn't exploit their success because supply trucks never arrived. The same mechanical failures that plagued Panthers and Tiger IIs turned the advance into a roadside graveyard of broken-down vehicles. Crews abandoned perfectly functional tanks simply because there was no fuel to move them forward or back. Within 2 weeks, the Leibstandarte had lost 40% of its strength and all but a dozen operational tanks. The 6th SS Panzer Army collectively lost at least 130 tanks and assault guns during Spring Awakening, with most being abandoned due to mechanical failure or lack of fuel. That same mathematics of attrition that had destroyed the division at Kursk was repeating itself, but faster and more completely. There were no reserves to rebuild with this time. There was no strategic depth to fall back to. This was truly the end. Otto Kumm, the division's commander, bitterly recorded the massive gap between Hitler's expectations and battlefield reality. We were sent into battle with high hopes, but insufficient fuel and ammunition. The men sensed the end was near. Morale was brave on the surface, but brittle underneath. His reports to higher headquarters grew increasingly desperate. He requested fuel. He requested ammunition. He requested air support. He received orders to attack. Marshal Tolbuchen's after-action report was colder, more clinical. The enemy's so-called elite divisions were unable to withstand sustained assault once their armored spearheads were isolated and deprived of supply. Just professional military assessment, stripped of all propaganda. The elite had been reduced to just another failed offensive in a long chain of failed offensives. Desertion rates climbed dramatically, with some units losing up to 10% of their manpower during Spring Awakening. Men who had held firm through Kursk, through years of brutal combat, began walking away when they saw officers hoarding fuel for their own escape vehicles. The iron discipline that had defined this elite unit was breaking under the weight of certain defeat. By March 15th, the offensive was over. 40% of the Leibstandarte's strength was gone. Their remaining tanks immobilized by fuel starvation and mechanical failure. Now came the retreat, and with it, the final disintegration of Hitler's elite guard. The retreat from Lake Balaton was chaos in its purest form. Tanks abandoned with their engines still running, their crews either fled or dead. Officers who had led men through years of war now watched those same men walk away from their posts, disappearing into the massive refugee columns flooding westward. The Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, Hitler's personal guard, was dissolving into the mud of Hungary and Austria. The disintegration was unprecedented for an SS formation. Officers reported men simply walking away from their posts without a word. The discipline that had held through Kursk, through years of savage warfare, finally snapped. An officer's report captured the moment perfectly. "We have lost all contact with several companies. The end is near and everyone knows it." Companies that had fought as unified, cohesive units for years simply ceased to exist overnight. Some men threw away their weapons and SS insignia, desperately trying to blend into civilian refugee columns. Others walked west in small groups, hoping to surrender to Americans rather than face Soviet captivity. SS-Unterscharführer Karl Kreutz wrote in March 1945, "We are fighting with the very last of our strength. The mud is everywhere, covering everything. Our tanks sink into it, break down, and the Russians never stop coming. We have lost so many friends, so many good men. I wonder if I will live to see Germany again." His letter was found on his body just 3 days later. A Soviet guard sergeant recorded the other side of this story. "The Germans attacked with many tanks, but we had artillery and complete air superiority. The ground turned black with burning machines. We took many prisoners. Some were just boys. Children, really, wearing SS uniforms and trying to hold back the Red Army with weapons they barely knew how to operate." During the chaotic retreat, Tiger II, Commander Obersturmführer Karl Brummen, destroyed 13 Soviet tanks in a single desperate engagement before his own tank was finally knocked out, and he was captured. His crew fought their immobilized Tiger II as a stationary fortress, knocking out Soviet armor at point-blank range until a shell finally penetrated the side armor. Brummen earned grudging Soviet respect for his skill and courage. But one tank commander's heroics couldn't alter the offensive's catastrophic failure. Individual skill, individual courage. None of it mattered anymore. The mathematics had already decided the outcome long before. At Vienna's Floridsdorf Bridge, remnants of the Leibstandarte and Hitler Youth units made their absolute last stand. For 2 brutal days, survivors held up Soviet advances with Panzerfausts at point-blank range. A desperate action born of having absolutely nothing left to lose. A Viennese civilian described the final chaos. The SS tried to hold the bridges, but when the order to retreat finally came, it was complete chaos. Vehicles burning everywhere, wounded men left behind, officers shooting at deserters. It was the end of the world for them and for us caught in the middle. The city burned. Civilians huddled in dark cellars while SS men and Soviet soldiers fought room to room in the streets above them. Then even that desperate stand ended. Otto Kumm, the division commander, escaped encirclement only by disguising himself as a civilian and evading Soviet patrols for days. He shed his uniform, his insignia, his entire identity as an SS general. He walked west with thousands of refugees, just another anonymous face in the desperate crowd. He later wrote bitterly about feeling betrayed by the German high command. But the real betrayal was strategic, throwing elite formations into desperate fire brigade roles to shore up collapsing fronts everywhere, wasting the best-trained troops in futile operations that actually accelerated rather than prevented the Third Reich's final collapse. The division that had begun the war as Hitler's proud elite guard finished it as scattered survivors in stolen civilian clothes, desperately trying to evade capture. Some made it to American lines and survived. Some were captured by Soviets and disappeared into prison camps, never to return. Some died in the chaos of Germany's final collapse, their bodies never identified or claimed. Elite status, in the end, was just another casualty of a war that had been lost long before these final battles were ever fought. From 90 tanks at Kursk, with losses ranging from 50 to 70%, and only a handful of Panthers still operational by battle's end, down to the final dozen vehicles limping away from Lake Balaton. The Leibstandarte's destruction perfectly charts the collapse of Nazi Germany's military illusions. No amount of elite training, no depth of ideological fanaticism, no superiority of individual equipment could possibly compensate for strategic bankruptcy, complete logistical exhaustion, and facing an enemy that had mastered industrial-scale total warfare. The elite guard that once paraded triumphantly through conquered capitals ended as desperate boys with Panzerfausts at a Vienna bridge, their officers disguised as civilians and fleeing encirclement in stolen clothes. Elite status, it turned out, offered no immunity whatsoever to defeat, only a longer, more painful fall from grace. The mathematics were always stacked against them from the beginning. The logistics were always completely impossible. The overall strategy was always fundamentally bankrupt, and in the end, none of the propaganda, none of the ideology, none of the exceptional tactical skill mattered one bit. They died the same way every other defeated army throughout history has died. Hungry, exhausted, cold, and abandoned by the leaders who had sent them off to fight an unwinnable war. If you found this story compelling, hit that subscribe button for more deep dives into World War II history every single week. Thanks so much for watching.